locking out our economies and future into dirty and expensive energy sources.
Developed countries skirt culpability for their past, present, and future emissions by promising to achieve net zero or carbon neutrality by 2050. A deceptive language premised on cancelling out emissions in the atmosphere through techno-fixes, accounting tricks, and carbon markets, rather than eliminating their costs. The capitalist drive for growth, expansion, and profit.
Indeed, some of the proposals on the table not only distract us from the real plans and action that equitable and justly address the crisis we face. They also seek to further colonize our territories and resources while profiting off our vulnerability.
Projects such as forest conservation, renewable energy farms, and biofuel plantations in developing countries created to give rich countries and their corporations pollution permits are driving massive land grabbing and subsequently the displacement of our indigenous peoples, local communities, and forest dwellers. This is climate imperialism.
Developed countries are not providing their fair share of finance to help us cope with climate change. In fact, they could not even deliver the bare minimum of the climate finance promise they made more than a decade ago. Instead of settling their climate debt, developed countries are burying us deep in loans for projects that do not address the real needs of the most climate vulnerable.
Because developed countries are not fulfilling their responsibility, we now contend with the social, economic, environmental, and cultural impacts of climate change that are already beyond adaptation. For years, we have been calling for just compensation to deal with the damages to property and livelihood and loss of biodiversity, culture, community, and lives because of global warming. And yet, rich countries like the US and the UK that have built their wealth off fossil fuels are blocking efforts that would set in stone their liability and obligations.
Meanwhile, COVID-19 threatens to further deepen pre-existing problems of corporatized development, marginalization of people in the development process, and socio-economic inequalities. Economic recovery strategies, dubbed as the new normal, are increasingly unfolding to be the same policies that have led to the monopolization of natural resources, privatization of social wealth, and rising temperatures. In many instances, with the urging of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, important legislations and regulations to protect communities and the environment are reversed.
The crisis is only further aggravated with the erosion of people's democratic rights, such as our right to access to information, participation in the development process, and our right to organize and mobilize. We are enraged at how the UK government is using COP26 as a public relations stunt to greenwash its image and to posture as a global climate leader, despite failing to ensure the safe and democratic participation of parties, civil society, and the people's movements from the global south.
We face worsening repression, harassment, imprisonment, and killings at the hands of the state forces and big foreign corporations that want to capture our lands, rivers, mountains, forests, and other natural resources. We are communities and people in the front lines of the climate and social crisis, and we need nothing less than climate justice and system change.
We demand historic polluter implement immediate, rapid, and deep emissions cuts without the use of tech threats and false solutions that violate our human rights, rural and indigenous communities. We demand an equitable and just fossil fuels pass out at a pace consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
We demand developed countries deliver their promise of $100 billion a year in new and additional public climate finance, while also committing to a new finance goal based on the actual needs of frontline communities.
We demand advanced capitalist countries
to provide additional public finance and compensation to the most affected peoples and areas bearing the brunt and losses and damages from climate breakdown to help them recover and rebuild their lives.
We reject carbon markets and all other false solutions to climate change that led to the plunder of our resources by the global north countries and corporations. We reject imperialist trade pacts that empower polluters and prevent people's access to climate-friendly technologies and low-carbon alternatives.
We support climate solutions, protecting biodiversity and preserving ecological balance, while safeguarding food sovereignty and people's rights. Securing land and tenure rights for indigenous peoples, farmers, and local communities are important in achieving such goals. We advocate for community-owned and controlled renewable energy systems.
We demand the recognition and protection of the rights of land and environmental defenders as essential frontliners to the climate crisis. In solidarity with the broader sectors and movements working for system change, we call for a new economics for the people and planet, not profits.
We are communities and peoples in the front lines of the climate and social crisis. We vow to fight for these demands inside and outside of the official climate negotiations with the broad masses in Glasgow and across the world.
Climate justice now.
Climate justice now.
Climate justice now. People and planet over profit.
People and planet over profit.
End climate imperialism now.
End climate imperialism. People and planet over profit.
Yes, climate justice now. Thanks for that video, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm Srishti Bajpayee. I'm an activist researcher joining you from Mumbai, India. And I'm part of the Global Tapestry of Alternatives and the moderator for today's session, which I'm very, very happy about and really looking forward to. So welcome for today's event, which is organized by Southern People's Action on COP26 and the International League of People's Struggle. And what we intend to do in this session is to report back of what happened at COP26 and ways forward, basically to also have a bit of a critical analysis and discussion on the recently concluded COP26 negotiations and what challenges lie ahead of people's organizing and campaigning for climate justice. And so before we begin, let me remind everyone of some basic house rules. Your microphones are on mute, but feel free to introduce yourselves, where you're joining from, put your questions, comments, and reflections in the chat box. And please use the Q&A and chat box as actively as you can. We really encourage you to do so. Please note that the meeting is being recorded and live streamed. So share the link in case with your friends and colleagues. We do not tolerate any harmful, oppressive, or abusive behavior that excludes, threatens, or disrespect others. So it's a request to all the participants and everybody who's joining the meeting that we try to avoid such behavior, and facilitators will remove if any participant is engaging in such a behavior. And let us ensure that we don't use a lot of jargon and acronyms so that this place is inclusive enough for everybody. And also to all the panelists and also to myself that we speak slowly and not too fast, and so that everybody is in line with whatever is being spoken about. So yeah, I hope the basic house rules are clear, and let's move forward onto the discussions. As the dust has settled after the conclusion of COP26 climate talks, and the public now has a clearer picture of the outcomes of Glasgow Pact, which has been acknowledged as a compromise deal. not only compromise it, but in many ways is also very devastating for our futures. And there are enormous challenges lying in front of us, namely few climate action pledges, especially by major emitters as they stand, put the world on track of dangerous warming levels by the end of the century. Announced climate finance pledges do not measure up to the needs of the vulnerable and the most marginalized communities to enhance or adapt their resilience in the face of increasing catastrophes. Agreed carbon market tools will undermine climate ambition while also paving the way for the further colonization of lands and forests of indigenous and other nature dependent communities. So we have invited a panel of speakers to enlighten us on how COP26 outcomes will impact the planet and the communities on the ground, and the responses of civil society and people's movement, and what do we need to do in the future. To start with, I would like to call Ivan Enerele, Climate Justice Program Lead of IBON International and one of the conveners of Southern People's Action on COP26. Over to you, Ivan.
Thank you, Shrishti, and allow me to express my sincerest thanks to all our panelists for giving us their precious time, despite their busy schedule, to be with us today and share with us their expert insights and perspectives on the recently concluded 26th Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC, or the UN Convention on Climate Change in Glasgow. I would like to also commend the campaign initiators of the Southern People's Action on COP26 and the International League of People's Struggles, not only for this report back session that we are having today, but also for the very successful global campaign around COP26 that saw many activities and mobilizations organized by people's movements in the Global South. And of course, thank you to everyone attending for today's webinar session. So I would like to start by sharing with you a curious incident that happened to me this week when I received an invitation from the Philippine Lower House Committee on Climate Change for a debriefing today on COP26 sponsored by the Philippine delegation. And yesterday, I received a call from their committee secretariat coordinator confirming my participation as CSO resource speaker. But then she followed that with a caveat that we refrain from any acts that could be deemed as grandstanding. And the coordinator likewise expressed the committee's apprehension about the organization that I represent for being aligned in her own terms with extremist positions. Right. So she also mentioned their committee's concern, apprehension also, that my invitation was sponsored by a Congress representative. She was Representative Euphemia Colyamat of People First Party List, or Bayan Muna Party List. And Congresswoman Euphemia Colyamat happens to come from an indigenous community. So needless to say, I took offense with the choice of words that she said towards me. But also that made me think, right, that perhaps one of the reasons why the climate crisis that we find ourselves in, continues to bring massive suffering and pain to frontline communities is because our ideas and actions are not extreme enough, right? So we have been told, for example, to celebrate the Glasgow Climate Pact, that at least a 2.4 degrees Celsius warming, is better than 4 degrees Celsius. But for most of us in the Global South, even at the current warming level of 1.8 degrees Celsius, the impacts are already catastrophic. And then take, for example, also the position of the Philippine government on climate finance from the recent meeting that I just came from this afternoon, that because developed countries are not fulfilling their obligations, then the alternative, according to them, according to one of the members of the official delegation, is to borrow loans, right, from multilateral development banks. And the said official also, derided civil society demands for climate justice as mere theorizing, while their proposal is, coming from a pragmatic standpoint. But then the current reality is that loans, right, are already accounting for a staggering 71% of climate finance. And climate finance as loans is what's already happening. So it's really not an alternative. And not only has the current climate finance regime failed to deliver the needs of developing countries to adapt and enhance their resilience to climate impacts, it is also burying us deeper in poverty and increasing our vulnerability. So it is clear to us, at least in the civil society and people's movements, that the extreme solutions required by the extreme situation that we are in will not come from governments and institutions. These extreme solutions will have to be fought for in the parliament of the streets by us in the people's movement and civil society and the grassroots communities that we work with who contend with the losses and damages of super typhoons, storm surges, droughts, and heat waves, but also compounded by government neglect, corporate greed and plunder, colonialism, and imperialism. And so as we all collectively try to make sense of the betrayal of our leaders and institutions and the recently concluded climate negotiations in Glasgow, we also look forward to hearing on how we will continue the struggle for the extreme change we want, the struggle for climate justice. So thank you, everyone, and looking forward to hearing from the expert insights of our friends and panelists for today's webinar session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ivan. Very important point of people's struggle, which is very crucial, as well as systemic and transformative changes that we must strive for. So let me not wait any further and introduce our panelists for today, who are some amazing people who have been working on climate justice movement and issues and have some very insightful sharing on the assessments of the COP26 negotiations, their impacts on the planet and the people, and how they measured up to the Global South's demand for climate justice. We are really honored to have with us environmental activist, poet, and architect Nemomo Bassi. Nemomo serves on the advisory board and is director of the Health of Mother Earth Foundation, an environmental think tank and advocacy organization. We are happy to hear from Indigenous people's rights activist Beverly Longit. Beverly is a coordinator of Indigenous people's movement on self-determination and liberation and the international officer of the Katribu, National Alliance for Indigenous Peoples Organization in Philippines. We also look forward to hearing the expert insights of Harjeet Singh, Senior Advisor on Climate Impacts of Climate Action Network. Prior to joining CAN, Harjeet led ActionAid International's climate change work globally. He's also a member of the United Nations Technical Expert Group on Comprehensive Risk Management under Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. We are excited to hear from Liamay Torres, Executive Director of the Center for Environmental Concerns Philippines, a nonprofit organization working on environmental research, education, policy advocacy, and campaigns. We are also joined by scholar activist Vasna Ramasar, a core member of the Global Tapestry of Alternatives and the Post-Development Academic Activist Group Pedagogue. Finally, from the youth group, we have the National Coordinator of Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, John Bonifacio. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, for promising us to have very interesting and exciting discussion today and what it really means for movements to move forward on the climate action. So one of the concerns which Ivan was also talking about and have been raised by various civil society movements and groups is that COP26 did not go far enough to keep the world below 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise. And in fact, according to estimates, will lead to a dangerous 2.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise, which is going to be catastrophic for many countries in the global south, and it already is. So let's hear from Nemomo Bassi, who has a pre-recorded interview for us, intervention for us, and let's see what he has to say on this.
I bring you greetings and thank you for giving me this space to share some thoughts about the Conference of Parties, COP26, that was held recently in Glasgow. To start with, that conference excluded many people on the excuse relating to the coronavirus pandemic. Many people could not have vaccines, or those who were from so-called red list countries couldn't just make it, except they were prepared to be quarantined and they spent a long time before attending the conference. Now, the conference itself did not surprise many of us because it was based on the wrong premise. The Paris Agreement set a temperature target of 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level, and then the other tag upper level, so-called upper level, of well below 2. You will agree with me that well below 2 should be less than 1.5. And if you agree with me, it means that 1.5 and well below 2 were just arbitrary figures thrown at the world. Moreover, the 1.5 degrees Celsius was taken as a global average. And for a continent like Africa, known to suffer about 50% higher than the global average, having a 1.5 global average target as the lower end of temperature increase above pre-industrial levels means Africa would have experienced or would experience more than 2 degrees at that level, if 50% above the average. The same would happen to many countries in Asia who are more or less around the equator and have tropical weather patterns. And so when the world celebrated 1.5, they were celebrating a temperature target that already sentences many citizens of the global south to extreme, unpredictable weather conditions. And so Glasgow was to consolidate Paris Agreement, and one of the outcomes that people celebrate is that it has agreed on some aspects on how to implement the Paris Agreement. Now, the other thing, one of the ways that the implementation of Paris Agreement was accomplished at COP26 is that many of the actions, climate action, can now be based on carbon trading. And you know that carbon trading is not in any sense emission reduction. It's just a piece of arithmetic that allows speculators to make profit from the misery of the world. One of the cardinal outcomes of COP26 was the bringing to the table of the concept of net zero, which is another name for carbon offsetting. So net zero doesn't mean zero. This is what civil society was saying all through the time of the conference. Because net zero simply means you continue with business as usual, or perhaps you do something, maybe go into renewable energy, but you can continue with business as usual, continue polluting, and deflect the action either to nature or something, whatever, some facilities that you may have, equipment that you may have constructed for carbon capture and storage, or some other thing, geoengineering, placing mirrors in the sky, whitening the clouds, or fertilizing the ocean, or some other means of solar radiation management. So it doesn't really mean tackling the problem at source. So COP26 did not offer the means of reducing emissions. It only offered means of carbon trading, carbon offsetting, and so-called net zero by 2050, or by 2060, or by 2070, which means they were deflecting the action to the future and forgetting about today, which was one of the most shocking things you could imagine from that conference. Avoiding action today and piling up for children and children's children to tackle in future. And so this was clearly unacceptable, totally unacceptable. We also saw that negotiations on loss and damage was left at a very preliminary level. And so countries and nations and territories like the small island states in the Pacific, Asian countries, African countries, Latin American countries who are already suffering massive impacts of global warming would continue to suffer from these impacts and even more impacts without immediate support or compensation for loss and damage. This wasn't surprising, because the rich polluting countries are not willing and not ready to accept responsibility. And brothers and sisters, you remember that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was based on the Justice Platform of Common but Differentiated Responsibilities, which meant those who have contributed most to the problem should also do most to solve the problem. Right from COP15, when the voluntary emission reduction paradigm came into being, it has been business as usual, and countries only commit to cut emissions at a level that is convenient to them. And so, as the IPCC showed, climate change, the serious climate impacts are already on track to continue, like sea level rise and other unpredictable weather patterns are set to continue and may not be reversed except we take dramatic actions today. And so I round up this by reflecting a bit more on the basis of the Paris Agreement and also the Glasgow Climate Pact. And this is the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. When nations submitted their NDCs updates 5 years after Paris, and that was about July, August this year, the United Nations Environment Programme calculated that if these temperature figures, if the reduction levels were maintained, the world would suffer 2.7 degrees Celsius temperature increase above pre-industrial level. Now, before or during the COP, other countries brought different suggestions of nationally determined contributions, more pledges, and it was estimated that the temperature increase in the future around 2050 or turn of the century may now be 2.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level. As I said at the beginning, 2.4 Celsius, that would be the global average. For countries around the equator, this would probably mean about 3.6 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level. This would be total catastrophe. And so you agree with me that the outcome of the COP26 is by no means a solution to global warming, but rather sentencing humans on the planet to totally unpredictable and catastrophic global warming. And so I hope you join me to say thumbs down to COP26 and demand that future COPs must go back to holding industrialized nations accountable and demanding measurable, binding emission reduction. Otherwise, we are just sentenced to carry out adaptation measures and building resilience with whatever resources we have. Because even the climate finance of 100 billion per year from 2025 is not going to happen. It's not on track to happen. And we have to fight for today, because without today, there's no guarantee of any future. Thank you.
Thanks, Nimomo. It's quite frustrating to note how much of the debate still on climate issues is from the most developed nations and from their perspectives and their lives, which has led to where we are, and it still continues to do so. Nimomo will join us later for Q&A. He's not there with us at the moment, but he will. So please write down all your questions, comments, reflections for Nimomo and other panelists in the Q&A box. Let's move on the nature and protection and zero deforestation pledges. So among the first announcement made at COP26 was the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use, in which 137 countries committed to collectively end forest loss and land degradation by 2030. So now I would like to turn to Beverly to give us the indigenous people's critical assessment of this declaration. Beverly will give us an overview of the pledges made by the countries with regard to the declaration and what really in it's for the indigenous people and other local nature-dependent communities.
Warmest greetings to all our participants. I've been asked by the organizers to speak on the pronouncement of COP26 on forest. One, among the first and most significant announcement in COP26 relative to forests would be the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forest and Land Use. Here, 141 leaders as of November 12 pledged to end and reverse deforestation by 2030. This declaration has mobilized climate finance to forests as follows. 1. 12 donor countries pledged to provide $12 billion of public climate finance from 2021 to 2025 to a new global forest finance pledge. This will support action in developing countries, including restoring degraded land, tackling wildfires, and advancing the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. 2. In addition, 12 country and philanthropic donors pledge at least $1.5 billion to protect the forests of the Congo Basin. This is the area home to the second largest tropical forest in the world, which is critically important to global efforts to address climate change as well as to sustainable development in the region. And 3, 14 country and philanthropic donors also pledge at least $1.7 billion from 2021 to 2025 to advance indigenous peoples and local communities, forest tenure rights, and support their role as guardians of forest and nature. But these pledges, if they do come true, are made within the next 10 years. In addition, this commitment involves halting forest loss associated with agricultural commodity production and trade, the removal of deforestation or the cutting of trees to make space for animals to graze or crops to grow from the global trade of food and other agricultural products such as palm oil, soya, and cocoa. These, together with extractive industries and energy projects, are the major causes of forest loss. The rising cases of threats, harassment, and violence against indigenous peoples and local communities are also raised within the statement. Sounds good. In paper, there is recognition of the climate emergency, on the importance of forests, and of the role of indigenous peoples and local communities in protecting forests and biodiversity and in combating the climate emergency. Are not these some of the demands of climate activists? Let's take a closer look into the language of the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forest and Land Use that states to achieve a balance between anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions and removal by sinks. 1. The declaration is a reworded justification for the already failed carbon market mechanisms. It calls to offset rather than to stop carbon emissions and polluting activities. Essentially, it is a profit investment scheme for corporations to allow the continuation of their environmentally destructive, harmful activities, especially in the global south, while maintaining a pro-environment facade. 2. Signatories to the pledge are collectively driving deforestation through, for example, the European Union Mercosur Free Trade Agreement, which will increase beef imports to the European Union by 50%. And this is a crucial driver of Amazon deforestation. Brazil, another signatory to the agreement, is engaged in a large-scale offensive, large-scale attacks against indigenous peoples in Brazil, even while pledging to support them in Glasgow. 3. With this, the declaration fails to hold governments and corporations to account. There are no concrete regulatory actions to stop carbon emissions and polluting activities such as mining, energy projects, and land conversions for agribusiness and agricultural and livestock industries. The declaration, while it recognizes the important role of indigenous peoples and local communities in the protection of forests, but such recognition can be made more effective can be made more meaningful by binding these commitments to international human rights standards, such as the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and Peasants. The COP26 has ended. What now? What should we do? What are the things we need to follow through? The situation of climate emergency calls for accountability and action. One, we should take into mind that the tireless struggles of indigenous peoples, forests, land and water defenders, climate activists brought out these positive concessions. This marks the importance of the coordinated and complementary roles of both inside and outside actions, of negotiations backed by direct actions, not only in the venue of COP, but also of people's organizations and communities in the front lines. These pledges should not remain as empty promises. We hold the parties to deliver on their commitments. We should also exercise vigilance on the pledges made and ensure management, use, and monitoring of the funds. These should not go into false and market-based solutions under the name of so-called nature-based or community-based solutions. We take note that in 2014, around 40 countries signed the New York Declaration on Forests that aimed to stop by half deforestation by 2020 and end it by 2030. However, 40% forest loss has been made since 2014, and around 10 million hectares of forest is lost every year. We should not allow this to happen. The need to protect remaining forests cannot be understated. Forests are the lungs of the planet, absorbing a third of the greenhouse gas emissions each year. It slows down global warming and it decreases carbon dioxide emissions that are also highly dependent on forests. We are running out of time. Let's go beyond keeping the conversations alive on the need to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now more than ever, we have to up the ante to stop the drivers of climate emergency. We say no to large-scale destructive dams, energy projects, commercial agricultural and livestock land conversion scheme, and large-scale destructive mining. Hopefully, these should be able to give irrepressible pressure for responsive policy changes and creation of responsive institutions. We also need to stop greenwashing and change the current narratives and discourses. Reforestation is not simply planting trees neatly in a row. Inappropriate tree planting, such as introduction of non-invasive, non-native, and fast-growing trees, can cause more harm than good. Forests are not just an ecosystem. They are also home to millions of indigenous peoples. Our survival and identity as indigenous peoples are intertwined with forests. The destruction of forests is also explicitly linked to violation of our human rights and right to self-determination. These include dispossession of our lands and resources, threats and violence, as well as loss of access to food, clean water, and our traditional medicines, destruction of our culture and spirituality. Thus, indigenous peoples and local communities must be made genuine partners in forest protection and reforestation. Crucial to this is the respect of indigenous peoples' rights to free, prior informed consent and the right of communities to say no to any destructive project or program in their areas. We need to work together to develop a comprehensive and integrated response to the climate crisis that shall create jobs and livelihoods, genuinely respond to the urgency of keeping global temperature down, and respectful of indigenous customs, traditions, and practices that are not harmful to people and planet. This would involve strengthening multi-stakeholders and exclusive partnerships, development cooperation, and international solidarity for people and planet. Together, let's work for system change, not climate change. Warm greetings and thank you.
Yeah, Beverly was spot on how, despite this pledge, governments across the world have been diluting forest laws, promoting hydropower and other such so-called renewable energy as new way of combating climate crisis and displacing communities and devastating their ecosystems. What she mentions about the rights of the indigenous communities is extremely important. And along with that, I would also add the rights of the rest of nature, and their right to exist and persist must also be part of these articulations because it is closely linked to the rights of indigenous communities and local communities. So let's move on. Thank you, Beverly, for this important intervention. Let's move on to climate finance. Over a decade ago, developed countries promised to mobilize $100 billion of climate finance per year by 2020 for climate adaptation and mitigation for developing countries. This promise remains to be realized. Civil society and people's movement that came to COP26 made it clear that developed countries have the obligation to provide their fair share of finance to enable developing countries to adapt the impacts of climate change and transitions. And at the same time, they are demanding reparation for loss and damage due to increasing weather extreme. So the question that we are posing to Harjeet is, did developing countries get from COP26 the finance and support they needed? Over to you, Harjeet.
Thank you, Shrishti, and thank you for having me. And this is a very useful conversation and a great time to reflect on what happened and how we really take this work forward. And I agree with my previous speakers. We are absolutely nowhere near where we need to be. And when we talk about finance, it is a matter of justice. We cannot just expect developing countries to take up mitigation and also do adaptation. And now they are suffering with climate impacts, or what we call loss and damage in the UNFCCC space. So clearly we are not there, and as you said, Shrishti, the $100 billion target, which is actually a drop in the ocean when you look at how much money is needed. We have to talk about trillions, but $100 billion is so important, like a seed, to leverage those trillions. And if we don't get that $100 billion right, we will not be able to achieve the kind of climate action we are talking about across the spectrum, from mitigation, adaptation to dealing with loss and damage. And that $100 billion has not been coming the way it was committed. In fact, the COP started at a very wrong note, because just before the COP began, the delivery plan that rich countries presented collectively admitted and regretted that $100 billion is not going to be provided until 2023, which I would say was not only frustrating but very shameful on part of developed countries who could roll out trillions to fossil fuel industry and other polluting industries in no time as part of COVID recovery plans. Fossil fuel industry continues to enjoy subsidies to the tune of $11 million a minute. $11 million a minute, but we could not find $100 billion a year for the developing world. Now, that's the kind of inequality that we see, and clearly shows where the focus is and how rich countries have been guarding the interest of polluters more than meeting their responsibility and commitment of providing money, as we know, which was committed long ago. And still that is not being met. And by their own admission, more than 70% are loans and guarantees. So when we as civil society and developing countries have been demanding that bulk of that money, ideally 100%, has to be public finance. And I would repeat, if that happens to be a seed money to leverage trillions, and if that becomes loan, then how developing countries are going to leverage those trillions if they're paying that money with interest? Now, out of that $100 billion, when rich countries said only $80 billion are being provided, 25% of that happens to be adaptation, which means only $20 billion, which is nowhere near the target that we have put forward, which is at least 50% of money should be going for adaptation. And we need to understand the fact that for adaptation, markets are not providing any support. For renewable energy, you still have market investments that are going to help make that transition. But for adaptation, nobody is going to pay to poor people to raise the plinth of their houses or retrofit their homes or build dikes or adapt to the changing weather conditions so that their agriculture can survive. So this is really very painful to see that communities are not getting adequate support to prepare themselves for the disasters. And when we talk about loss and damage, and we have to look at the whole issue as a continuum, we have not done mitigation sufficiently over the last 30 years. We are not providing sufficient resources for adaptation, and communities are already suffering loss and damage. And here, $100 billion becomes extremely crucial, and we don't see that money being real and money being delivered. Some of the other issues that we raised at this COP, that the money that's going to be talked about, how it's going to be accessible for vulnerable and developing country parties, and not for corporations who are going to take that money back to the developed countries. That issue has not been addressed. The decisions that have come out of this COP also have been much more about private finance. If you read the text, the reference to private finance has increased, and you would find that reference in case of adaptation and also in case of loss and damage. And of course, we know what happened. On one hand, on the inside, we were struggling to even secure commitment for $100 billion. And on the outside, those big corporates were conveniently talking about trillions of dollars and said, oh, we are going to make $130 trillion available for climate action. Where is that money? Who is going to get that money? Is it going to poor communities and governments to make the transition or to become resilient, or now to even recover from the climate impacts that they're already facing? So such a huge disconnect that we saw on the inside and on the outside. There have been some steps that are taken on the positive side, where adaptation finance now, there's an agreement it's going to be doubled, but only by 2025, and also of the current scale. So as I was saying, it's about $20 billion, and if it's going to be doubled, we will get $40 billion a year by 2025 without any roadmap how that increment we are going to see between now and 2025. Similarly, there has been some agreement on having an ad hoc working group and a program to look at new finance goal. As you know, Paris Agreement clearly mentions that $100 billion, which came out of thin air, remains the floor, and it doesn't reflect the real cost of climate action, which is going to be in trillions. And we have been hearing from Africa, for example. Africa said that they would be needing at least $1.3 trillion a year by 2030. Similarly, when India made its announcement, they said we need $1 trillion to achieve the target that they have put for 2030. So we need trillions of dollars, and as per some estimates, we will need $2.5 to $4 trillion a year to make the transition that is needed, and we're not really getting there. Now, coming to loss and damage, and as we know that we went there with two broad things. One was Santiago Network, which is the technical facility that was supposed to be operationalized, which was agreed in 2019 in Madrid. And the second was loss and damage finance. And you may also be aware that as Climate Action Network, working with Loss and Damage Collaboration, Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, and many of our members and allies like Practical Action, Stamp Out Poverty, ActionAid, and many others, we decided that it's going to be the litmus test for us, and that's how we are going to judge the outcome of this COP. And we have been planning to make this as the major issue for the last several months, and we worked with various governments and civil society to make that happen. So, of course, we came with a very specific proposal on how loss and damage finance should become a major issue. On that, of course, we haven't got something concrete, But we were very pleased to see how the proposal that we had put forward on making loss and damage the key issue eventually became a proposal of G77 in China, which I must say is unprecedented, that a proposal that essentially pushed by civil society or a small group of developing countries reaches that level that it becomes the most important issue at this COP. Because this is such a fundamental thing, especially when communities are suffering now and rich countries have been delaying any action or any even discussion on loss and damage finance reaching that level. If I talk about the scale that is required, we will be needing $290 to $580 billion a year by 2030. That's the scale we are talking about, and not a single penny has been delivered so far. We went there with a very specific demand that we need to make sure that finance becomes a major issue. It did become, but rich countries, particularly led by the US, Japan, Canada, and the European Union, they ignored the demands, and what they offered was a dialogue, which of course was unacceptable, and there was a major pressure from the developing countries that this is not acceptable. But in the end, they agreed to move forward only with the condition that at COP27 they would like that facility to be agreed, and of course a dialogue that runs for 3 years has to result into this facility being operationalized. On loss and damage, from being not even on the agenda to becoming a major issue, I think we should also, I know there are a lot of things that did not happen, but definitely we as civil society should take credit for taking it to the level, and also a lot of learning on how, when we align our power, when we come together, when we make this as a fundamental issue, we can see progress. And personally, and I've spoken to people who have been behind this, we're also very positive, because the way we planned for it and the way we went with those details, including on Santiago Network. So what we have achieved is not a mean thing. Of course, there are still some pending elements in terms of the governance structure, but we have got the functions agreed, which means that going forward, we'll be able to secure some technical support for developing countries who are already suffering from loss and damage, and who will see millions getting displaced in the next few years. So at least we'll be able to put some systems in place and some capacity going forward. If I spend 2 more minutes now talking what we need to do going forward. So again, drawing a leap from what we achieved at this COP in terms of loss and damage and demanding justice for people who are already getting impacted. I think there's a lot of learning that we got. One, we should not look at these COPs and those meetings as the places where everything is going to be delivered. These are only one of those spaces. We have to do a lot of work in the national capitals and between these meetings, which means we have to be movement driven and not moment driven. Those moments are important, but it is very crucial for us to develop that movement together. And on some of these issues that I've been talking, we have taken that direction. And going to Africa COP, it has to be a COP of the vulnerable people and communities. We have to nurture the seed that we planted in terms of technical work and doing a lot more political mobilization and outreach in both developed and developing countries, because we know who blocked that progress. And we now need to work in those countries and push those countries and governments to come prepared. We have to build alliances, which has to be led by Africa for this COP and going beyond. And all the mobilization that we did has to now result into very concrete actions. And as I said, not only at this COP, but all the opportunities that we get over the next year and beyond. So really, we have some positive learning from this experience, and we have to build on that and build movement to achieve justice for people who are facing climate crisis and who are living on the front line. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Harjeet. I think those were very important and crucial insights into the whole finance aspect of COP. And I think a bit of a positive news that you shared is also very crucial, and also gives some sense of going forward of how we need to also at local, regional, and national levels also do many strategic alliances and work so that the work begins to happen here and we can take forward some of that at the COP, which is happening in Africa next. So thanks so much for those comments. Let's move on to the other aspect of it, which is human rights. The defense of environmental defenders is again one of the very crucial aspect and the key issue that many civil society groups have been raising and also raised this time in Glasgow. Although not an agenda item at the COP official negotiations, there's an increasing recognition that one of the keys to keeping the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius is to recognize, protect, and promote the important role of environmental and human rights defenders. However, in 2020, Global Witness recorded 227 lethal attacks, an average of more than 4 people a week, making it once again the most dangerous year on record for people defending their homes, lands, and livelihoods and ecosystems vital for biodiversity and climate. Leah, I know that CEC spearheads one of the regional campaign formations in defense of environmental and human rights defender. So could you please tell us how the defense of environmental defenders figured in the Glasgow negotiations and the campaigns of your organizations on it? Over to you, Leah.
Hi, thank you. Can the organizer put up the presentation? So as Shristi mentioned, I am from the Asia Pacific Network for Environment Defenders. It is a solidarity campaign network of organizations working on environmental issues and defense of environmental defenders. So we were organized in 2018, and from then we have gathered different organizations from the region. Okay. Can I have the PowerPoint up, please?
Leah, I think they might be sorting out some technical difficulties. So if you could continue, and meanwhile, the presentation will be up on the screen.
All right. Okay,
Sorry.
so thank you. So talking about COP26 and environmental defenders, one of the things that people usually ask us is that what happened in the COP26 with regards to the call to defend environmental defenders. So the issue was talked about in many side events and outside events in the duration of COP26. Among the loudest voices were the indigenous people who among their ranks have the highest number of killings of environmental defenders, such as the indigenous people from the Amazon forests. Next slide. For our part, we raised the issue of the attacks of environmental defenders in Asia, such as the arrest of activists from Mother Nature Cambodia in September 2020 for a social media post opposing land reclamation in their community. A representative from the youth in Cambodia was present in the COP26 and performed a tree blessing activity, not only for their peers, but also for environmental defenders killed in the past years. There were also discussions on the ongoing military junta in Myanmar. Aerial bombings in the Salween Peace Park protected area on March 27 killed 107 people and 550 on April 5, 2021 alone. This was perpetrated by the Tatmadaw, or the military, which is also one of the biggest investors of the mining industry in the country. And while I was in Glasgow, a personal friend of mine was abducted in the Philippines for being a suspected communist rebel, despite his important contributions against deforestation and in establishing sustainable agricultural systems in the northern part of the country. So despite wanting to participate in the campaign to surface Steve Abwa I was a bit distracted going into COP26 with all those things happening back home. So despite these conversations, the issue was not discussed where it should have been one of the main agenda, which is in the negotiations of the world leaders. Just months before the start of COP26, Global Witness released a report stating that 227 land and environmental defenders were killed in 2020. 70% of these cases were related to the protection of forests, which are carbon sinks, therefore playing an important role in climate mitigation. From this lack of concern, we are not surprised that we did not gain commitments to address the attacks on environmental defenders. On the other hand, next slide. In the Glasgow Climate Pact, the outcome document of the COP26, there are provisions pointing to the necessity of including defending environmental defenders as part of the agenda in climate action. First, it emphasizes the importance of protecting, conserving, and restoring nature and ecosystems, including forests and other terrestrial and marine ecosystems, to achieve the long-term global goal of the convention by acting as sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases and protecting biodiversity while ensuring social and environmental safeguards. So as mentioned earlier, environmental defenders have worked tirelessly to do this through different conservation and rehabilitation activities and by stopping destructive projects from entering different ecosystems. Next slide. Second, the Glasgow Climate Pact also acknowledges the important role of a broad range of stakeholders at the local, national, and regional level, including indigenous peoples and local communities, in averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. So the basic principles around the issue should therefore be highlighted. Upholding the civil, political, human rights of environmental defenders contributes to the assertion of our environmental rights. They fill the gap of the lack of action of mandate holders such as the governments and serves as the checks and balances in the creation and implementation of policies regarding our environmental rights. And the achievement of the rights of environmental defenders are at the core of climate justice. It cannot be achieved if the very people who are most affected by the climate crisis are continuously under threats of attacks. Next slide. So moving forward from COP26, we can present these recommendations for different stakeholders. For the UN bodies, we recommend that the UN Human Rights Council to seek accountability, to help seek accountability and ensure protection of environmental defenders. For the UN Human Rights Council and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, to ensure that environmental defenders can actively participate in the climate solutions, and for different bodies to work together and coordinate with initiatives such as the Technical Working Group on Business and Human Rights Guidance and Respect for Human Rights, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, and the UN Environment Program Memorandum of Understanding on the Rights of Environmental Defenders, among others. You also recommend the governments to take action on the root of the attacks on environmental human rights defenders, which is resource conflict or the profit-oriented natural resource utilization that destroys our environment and violates human rights. And for environmental defenders and civil society organizations to unite for concrete solutions and collective action to pressure governments. So to end, I would just like to emphasize that despite the need to assert commitments are made inside the climate change talks, the burden of our work lies in our continuing efforts to address environmental issues and attacks on environmental defenders at the grassroots or community level up to the national and international level. At the end of the day, the UN system can only do so much, and it is actually our government that will implement the agreements of the various COPs. And as we have seen in history, real change lies with the people's movement to assert our rights. Thank you.
Thanks, Leah, for that very important aspect of how it is really important to defend the defenders and create enough ways and mechanisms that they can be protected, and also international solidarity that we need to do so wherever this happens. So thanks again for those very important points that you raised. Now let's move to our last panelist for the day, Vasna Ramasar, who will be speaking about the alternatives. So amid global leaders and institutions in action and people's movement are also mobilizing and defining alternatives to development pathways to address climate crisis, while at the same time struggling to claim rights and justice for their communities. Last November at the People's Summit of COP26 Coalition, the International League of People's Struggle, the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, and Adelante organized the event From Grassroots Resistance Towards Revolutionary Transformation, Visions from the Ground on the World We Want to Create. Something that I guess all the panelists have reflected upon, that how we need a systemic transformations. So Vasna, could you please share with us some of the highlights of that event and what's emerging from movements and envisioning from that?
Thank you very much, Shrishti, and hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to participate in this reflection session, because we do need to think about how we move forward. Having said that, I think for many of us, we did not go towards COP26 with high expectations of what would come out of that discussion. And I want to just touch on that first before talking about the alternatives. I think from the perspective that we take within the global tapestry of alternatives, we start from the focus that we have to acknowledge that this current system is deeply broken in being capitalist, Western, patriarchal, racist, modern. And that in itself places the COP26 within a particular dominant regime of action, which will never actually lead to the transformative change that we require for our current generation and for future generations. And as the earlier speakers have said, that transformation is critical. And it is also becoming more and more urgent that we do so. However, I do see that we have to recognize and acknowledge that within the COP process itself, we have had two significant elements taking place. One is that we've had a process where it is about false solutions coming up, as Harjeet said, with ideas that actually are transferring a lot of resources towards the private sector in actually trying to deal with this situation. And as Nemo had mentioned, there's a lot of technology optimism. Some of those technologies that are being funded have not been tested. But more than that, we are likely to see that some of the carbon capture and storage programs and other technologies will have deep implications for people in the global south, which are not fully being understood or being discussed. The second part that we see in this is also that all of this is more a game of climate delay rather than climate action. Pushing forward the dates for when decisions are made or when money will be provided is actually not going to give us the kind of action that is required right now from an ecological perspective. So having said that, I just want to remember the words that Audre Lorde, a feminist queer activist, said, that you cannot dismantle, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I think this is an important point to think about, in the sense that the COP26 occurs within a regime and framework that is already established in a deeply unjust system. And we cannot look to that system to provide us with the solutions going forward. And that's why the work of the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, the collaboration with Southern People's Action and ILPS has been about moving not just from grassroots resistance, but to that idea of revolutionary reconstruction, the need to actually think and look at alternatives in different ways. From our perspective, this has been critically important because of a number of reasons. One, it's that we have to move beyond the dominant system to start thinking about the idea that there is a pluriverse, both in terms of ways of doing things but also in terms of the knowledges that exist out there. There was a question raised earlier about what this means for Indigenous communities. Part of understanding the pluriverse is recognizing and giving space for these different thoughts. And one thing that we saw at COP26 was that there was acknowledgement of youth and Indigenous leaders, but done in a superficial way of giving them the platform to make a speech, but not the power to actually engage in the negotiations. If one looks at who was actually part of the different delegations, it's scary to see that circle of lobbying that exists around all of the main national delegates. And this is something that I think we have to recognize as a problem, and then look at where are we creating something different. I'm not sure that we can still rely on a COP26 process. Haji mentioned that we need to actually be mobilizing, sort of not just around the moment, but around the movement. And for us, that means that the mobilization around the movement has to be about trying to develop different solutions, not just ones that are coming out of the COP, not just waiting for what is happening in the COP. And when I say different solutions, we are talking about finding the radical alternatives, both in trying to create radical alternatives, but also to uncover and relearn a lot of the Indigenous knowledge, a lot of the older wisdoms that have existed in communities. With the work of the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, this is about trying to weave together, build and strengthen our independent movements, bring them together in solidarity. So this collective action being critically important, but also about actually learning so that we can continue to build something that isn't just local, but that has the connection to the global. One thing that we have seen with climate change is that the type of governance and the type of decision-making has been elevated up to this international level where nation states are making decisions about it. The voices of local people, the voices of the South are often not heard in that. And when they do get a chance in the formal proceedings, are often punished for being critical in what they say. So if we say that global regime as being a problem, what do we do in bringing the local together? And how do we actually do that in a way that allows for a lot of diversity? I think this is also for us critical in the global tapestry of alternatives, that the COP26 within a particular regime is about one world and one type of solution. It's a lot driven by finance and it's driven by technology. How do we actually make space for a pluriverse of ways of doing things? How do we learn from the incredible solutions that are already being practiced in communities, whether they are defending their territory or actually just trying to actually create what is a good life for themselves? And so we want this to be a strong part of the agenda and discussion of what we need for climate justice. And that's not necessarily what's in there in terms of the COP26. So what happens outside and beyond COP26? Clearly, things like the People's Summit have been very important, but we need more than that. How do we actually shift the conversation from simply a struggle against the system to the creation of a different system? We want to invite people to join us in that. And already in the work that the GTA is doing, there is so many endorsers and weavers who are actually finding ways to operate even within the suppressive structure that are emancipatory, that are decolonial, that are feminist. This is also something I think that came up as one of the questions. Those are not elements that we see in the COP process. Those are not elements I expect that we will ever see in the COP process going forward. So we have to create that alternative. I also want to pick up on a couple of other points that others have said. One of them is that we have to really think about this fact that the COP has become a way of moving money around, but not necessarily actually making any change happen in the world. if we see it for that, then we actually also need to accept that this is not something that we can hold to as being a place that we will find answers for the future. It has started on a wrong note, as Hajit mentioned, but it will always going to be on a wrong note from our perspective. So we need to look for the alternatives, and it's not in a singular, but it's in a plural. And with that as well, I want to raise a final point, which is to say that we are using a language which is defined by the UNFCCC, by the UN system, about how to talk about these issues. We're even mostly constrained by the fact that we're talking in English most of the time. How can we also find ways to think and move beyond that? As activists, we sometimes fall into the trap of using that same language, and we need to actually figure out ways to think and do things differently. Maybe it's not so much that we have to focus on justice only, but really bring in the notion of care, because care might be what takes us towards care of nature and care of each other as human beings. In South Africa, where I'm from, we talk about Ubuntu, that I'm a person through another person. These are the kind of alternatives that need to be taken seriously. We do not see that in COP. We do not expect to see that in COP. And so that begs the question, what next for our movement building? What next for the mobilization? How do we actually envisage and create that new world with alternatives? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Vasna, for raising some very important points. I think the idea that the alternatives, people's processes and solutions and initiatives are already articulating the kind of systems change we want, how we visibilize them more, and how do we bring those at the forefront is so much crucial. And definitely on the point of local articulations of the climate crisis, that is totally missing. And I'm reminded of something that a community member told me in Ladakh of how they define climate crisis is how spirits are angry, forest spirits are angry, mountain spirits are angry. And that's how they know that the rest of nature is not happy with what they're doing. So thanks for those comments. Let's move on to our last panelist. And a point that has been raised earlier by Nimumu also, that how COP26 was one of the most exclusionary COPs in the history, with many civil society organizations from Global South excluded because of vaccine inequality and the prohibitive cost of traveling to Glasgow. Nevertheless, civil society and people's movement made a good showing in terms of mobilization and disrupting the climate of exclusion in Glasgow. So John is here and he will tell us more about the actions that were taken and what's happening in that aspect. Over to you, John.
All right, thanks, Kirsty, for that introduction. So hi, I'm John. I'm from the Philippines. I'm part of Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, and also active on Fridays for Future MAPA, our most affected peoples and areas, which is like a global South network of Fridays for Future groups. So as Kirsty already talked about or mentioned earlier, we really made a good showing, like civil society and people's organizations, even with COP being so exclusive. And I think because COP is so exclusive, a lot of people decided that it's much more fruitful for people to just be outside where their voices can be heard, they can express what they can do. So we really saw that with the thousands of people who mobilized, for example, on Friday, the first Friday of COP, where around 25,000 people joined the youth strike. And the day after that, on Saturday, with the broader strike involving more sectors, over 100,000, I believe, participants were seen there in the strike on Saturday. So you can really see how many thousands of people were really clamoring for action outside of the conference. And even inside the conference, several actions were also done to highlight some of the injustices and some of the decisions that were being made. And some of these actions actually were done under the threat of debadging, meaning that our conference passes might have been revoked due to unprecedented security guidelines that really restricted permits for some of the actions. Some of our actions, for example, that tried to highlight the situation in Afghanistan were shut down initially, but we pushed through under threat of debadging. But those are the kinds of situations that were happening inside the conference. And I guess with all these actions, the message is really clear to really prioritize and include the global south and the most affected peoples and areas. And the reason why, as I mentioned earlier, the reason why many people took to the streets, I believe, was because the whole conference, as was highlighted earlier, was clearly not listening to or platforming the people most impacted, who should at the very least be included in the negotiations, especially since they are the ones who are impacted the most by the decisions there. And in the face of all those decisions by the world leaders, with all the empty promises to really do less than the bare minimum, actually, by 2030 or 2050, all of these far off future targets, seeing this many people stating that outside on the streets, stating that they have had enough, is clearly a good indication that people want change. And with the thousands again on the streets, it's clear that the call for climate justice is resonating with those in the global north, in Glasgow, and as well as elsewhere around the world, and particularly among the youth. And I think even among the people who attended those, attended the actions, really, there's a clear and a strong sentiment to find an alternative to the current system, our current system of capitalism and imperialism that's clearly rigged against us, as was highlighted by our previous speaker. And I think on the outside, for the people on the outside, the call is still very clear, and it's fundamental. And these calls are really fundamental for the continued survival of people and planet, particularly for the global south. And first things first, of course, is to commit to and execute rapid and just emissions reductions in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway, with a focus on the global north and its emissions debt. So the global north should really deliver more than just cutting their emissions by half by 2030. They should reduce much more than that due to their historic emissions debt, and to really deliver on the immediate and genuine and adequate climate finance from the global north to the global south, which begins, as highlighted by Harjeet earlier, with the $100 billion per year pledge. And moving beyond COP26, so right now where COP26 is done, and for some it seems like the discussion for climate is over, but of course it's not over. We can see that the solutions are still taking place outside of the summits and the meetings of world leaders, even on the regional or national or community levels. We can see that indigenous-led movements, for example, in North America and elsewhere around the world, have, by virtue of their organizing and mobilization, have stopped 400 coal plants worth of fossil fuel infrastructure from being built. And there's also organized resistance to large-scale foreign mines in my home country, the Philippines, for example, which has prevented and even crippled environmentally destructive operations. And we can see how activists around the world are making headway in pressuring their governments and corporations to give up a new fossil fuel infrastructure. So we can see much of the action is really taking place outside of these fancy conferences. And as the focus of the global climate discussion has really broadened to include climate finance, we can only expect that civil society and people's organizations will, in a lot of ways, already lead the way in this regard to ensure that the worst historic polluters commit the reparations and their broader climate debt in the soonest possible time. And unless there's any fundamental change, we can expect that the COPs will continue to leave us all on the outside, both, I guess, figuratively and literally. So I think on our end, we should really just continue to organize and mobilize outside to build an alternative to our current system of oppression and exclusion. I'll end it there. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, John, for a very important point of doing a parallel thing, but also seeking for active, inclusive space within COP. So let's move on to discussion that we will now invite questions that have come up from many of you who are participating in this session. We will first pose question to Harjeet because he has another commitment and has to leave immediately. So let's try to take on all the questions that have come up, but let's take on the first that are directly addressed to him, and he will be best placed to answer those questions. So Harjeet, without further ado, there was this first question on how zero emission is our demand in long term. Would it be possible to reduce carbon emission by providing financial support? Harjeet?
Well, absolutely. I think what we need to understand, and everybody has been saying, the issue of equity is really important. And rich countries have to move faster, they have to do more, and they have to provide money to developing countries. Now, developing countries whose economies, and we need to also understand it's also part of a legacy and colonialism, where their economies depend on fossil fuels. So asking them to make the transition as fast as rich countries need to do is going to be unfair and to people who are dependent on it. So we are talking about jobs, we are talking about people's income. So when we talk about transition, it has to be a just transition. It has to be orderly. It has to be supported. And I'm sure you would remember what happened when India made that statement. And coming from India, I can explain that a bit more and not defending the government. It really made a mess in terms of communicating it. But I think the implications are far-reaching for all developing countries. If we are only asking developing countries to move away from coal and not talking about oil and gas, so just to give you a number why we have to challenge that narrative. One, developing countries continue to depend on coal much more than oil and gas. And rich countries have moved from coal. That's where the whole industrialization began and was banking on. And now they've moved to coal, to oil and gas, which they continue to drill in their backyard. So I can give you a number. We have done research on 5 countries: Australia, Canada, Norway, UK, and the US. They are reducing their coal consumption by 30%, but increasing their oil production by 33% and gas by 27%, by 2030. So, and that's why you don't find oil and gas in that agreement and only coal and the amount of pressure they had put. So it has implications for all developing countries. So we need to transition. We need to move towards a fossil fuel free future, but we also have to talk about just transition, and it has to be supported. And there was another question about the facility and what we can do. I think I can speak very briefly on the loss and damage facility. So the very first intervention that came from Antigua and Barbuda on behalf of AOSIS and also G77 in China was about loss and damage. So we did not get the facility, but they made that intervention, after agreeing to that dialogue, saying it is insufficient, and we want that dialogue to deliver, and we want this facility to be delivered at COP27, which means there is going to be a massive fight. We have a lot of work to do. It is half victory, I would say. So because of the civil society pressure and exactly what John was saying, building pressure on the outside and having our people on the inside and doing that technical work, we need to connect inside-outside strategy, as other speakers also mentioned. And we are seeing the traction by doing that intelligently and in a focused manner. We need to do that, and getting that facility is going to be a start to make sure that justice is delivered to people who are facing climate crisis now, and they are going to be facing that in future. So I think we do have something to hold on to and mobilize people around it, and also show them that we can achieve success if we work together.
Thanks a lot, Harjeet. I think your point on organizing locally and organizing outside the space, the official space, is so important, I think, for various issues that needs to be done. So thanks for that intervention, and thanks for also joining us today and providing very insightful comments on the finance. Thanks so much. So there are more questions. The other possibly other panelists can decide who would like to take this on. If there's one concrete facility or mechanism from the COP26 that we Global South People's Movement can engage, leverage for their local struggles, what it would be? Would Nimomo, John, or anyone else like to answer or reflect on this question? Don't be shy. Nimomo or anyone else?
Maybe I can jump in here.
Thanks, Vasna.
Happy to hear from others more on this, but one thing that's not specifically from COP26, but earlier on, Indigenous communities, Southern people have actually were able to put in some text around climate debt. And that was very quickly removed from the negotiating text. So for me, that is one mechanism that I would really like to see that we fight to bring back. And this relates to what Harjeet was saying about loans. I mean, there's a shift in the power dynamic between I am loaning money to you with conditionality, or even I am benevolently giving money to you with still control and power, versus this is what is owed to people, and then with more control over it. So that's one mechanism I'd love to see come back into the process.
Yeah, important point. Anybody else in the panel would like to reflect on this? John, Nimomo.
Well, thank you so much for hosting this debriefing. And I came in a bit late, apologies. Let me just jump on, make a comment on the issue of the manner in which Global South negotiators go to the COP, especially when it comes to finance. It's really a very big challenge to go to the COP and expect to get a good outcome when you are negotiating for money from those who are the big polluters. And it gives them the upper hand. And I think we missed this by allowing them to get away with the idea of moving the justice aspect under the carpet. The COP has to recover the justice basis. The Glasgow Climate Pact referred to climate justice as something that is important to some people, not that it's important to everyone. And I thought that was a big insult on everyone who is suffering the impact of global warming, and a big insult to those who formulated the UNFCCC itself. It was based on common but differentiated responsibilities. And the responsibility should include historical responsibility. And so the issue of climate debt is not a grant, it's not a loan, it's not something, it's not charity. It's something that is being owed the global north, and they should be held to that. If they don't agree to climate debt, I don't see any reason why we need to keep going to the COP to keep moving around in circles and not achieve anything. Somebody has to pay for the damage. Somebody's suffering the impact. And I think that should be, we should have some cardinal minimum points without which we don't move forward. I mean, for example, I think I mentioned in the message I sent earlier, the Paris Agreement was very defective based on voluntary action. And we've seen it now. It's very clear now that the voluntary action is destroying the planet. At 1.5 or 2.0, contradictory, conflicting targets, and well below 2, I mean. And 1.5 meaning 2.2 for Africa. I don't see how anybody should accept that. The tears on Lumumba at COP15 keeps coming back to my memory. That time the debate was, don't put the minimum, don't put the target more than 1 degree. And the world begins to celebrate 1.5 and so-called 2.0. So let's demand for payment of climate debt and let it be a basic requirement for negotiation.
Thanks for that. Yeah, basic requirements, but also I think something that is coming in all the interventions that panelists have made is that, is COP really the place to go? And if it is really gonna solve or look at our demands. So that is a big question that that is there perpetually in all the comments. So there's another question. We're sorry that we can't take in, or I mean, we don't really have the time to take all the questions. So really sorry that we can't take all, but possibly one last question, which is very important in terms of also the gender aspect, which Amu has raised on how has the gender aspect come to COP, and are women to lead mainly only in the movements, or which is needed, of course, but they should also be there at COP too. So would Wasna, Leah, like to reflect on this?
Okay, so I posted an answer, but maybe just to elaborate. When we were there, I think there are many sessions that talked about women and gender and how gender equality principles should also be included when we talk about climate justice and climate action. But then again, many advocates or feminists are saying, how do we actually implement this, or how is it specifically included? So a lot of things can be lost with the commitments or overarching statements. So I think it's really important that we continue to look into how these statements develop into concrete action. And I mentioned also that in the Glasgow Climate Pact, it is mentioned that they encourage women's participation. But that's just a sweeping statement again. And how do we actually do it? Encouraging is different from ensuring that that actually happens.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. Wasna?
Yeah, I'd like to build on what Leah said and just make 3 points. One is that obviously the leadership of the COP and also who's actually the decision makers at the table reflects the leadership in the world. So it is still predominantly male. The second point is that, yes, we have had female leadership of the processes themselves, but we also should be aware that just because there is a woman doesn't necessarily mean that the way they're going to decide or run a process is going to be any different than if a man did it. That doesn't make it feminist in itself. And then the third thing, just related to what Leah was saying, it's so important in the how things are done, because a lot of the way that women are talked about and the gender aspects are talked about in terms of climate justice almost makes women victims and not actually showing the agency or giving them the possibility of directing their future themselves. So for me, this is something that we see classically in development as well, and we need to switch from just this focus on, you know, the gender difference in what is going to happen to a real feminist approach to it. Thank you.
True, very important point, and also not reduce it to tokenism, but rather having actual representation there. Ivan says that can Nimomo reflect on the question on carbon markets, and is there a specific okay, George has asked this question, assuming that some sectors remain very difficult to decarbonize, for example, aviation and steel production. So there's no scope whatsoever to use carbon offsetting to offset CHGs. Nimomo, would you like to reflect on that question?
Well, I think the question is a bit more complex than I would want to. Now, I'm joking. Now, the issue of the carbon markets, I'm totally opposed to carbon markets. And so my answer is that carbon markets should be shut down. COP26 was like a carbon trade fair. And we saw everything that happened there, the exhibitions in the Blue Zone, and the government officials, they're all trading carbon, either in agriculture or in all the sectors. And some people do believe that carbon pricing can help to reduce misbehavior. But I think the whole carbon trading idea is why we ended up with why the leaders brought up the net zero concept. Because then you could continue with business as usual, then buy some carbon credits and continue and achieve your net zero without changing the way you produce, the way you consume, and the way you destroy the planet. So one of the things that we need to cure actually is the removing market environmentalism completely from climate discussions, because the market created the problem and the market will not solve it.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Wasna, you also wanted to reflect on this question?
Yeah, I want to reflect on this and also maybe pick up on George's question directly to me if there's time. In regards to this question specifically about the fact that some sectors are quite difficult to decarbonize, I would like to counter that on 2 points. One is that Sweden is now producing fossil-free steel. So they have done a lot of work so that they do have green steel that's being produced. I recognize that it's in a very particular context, but it means that the technology is there and it is possible to do that. So I don't think we should close that option and just look at offsetting. The second is that, again, it's not just to look at offsetting, but aviation, we really have to have a conversation about who's flying, how much they're flying, what kind of consumption is happening before we should even be considering the offsetting. Because as Nemo said, that's a very flawed system. I also just want to relate to the question George asked about, is it really true that you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools? I agree with you, George, that yes, there can be incremental changes made. You can remove a door, remove a window, but you're not actually changing the system. So even giving women's rights in a patriarchal system doesn't always change everything. And I think it's also what, for me, is really important in this conversation is time. We don't have the luxury of time for slow incremental decision making to happen. We have to push for something more than that. Thank you.
Fantastic points, Vasna. Thanks for that. And to all the panelists for such concise but also very, very insightful comments all through. So thank you so much. As a moderator, I just had one question, which is about the rights of the rest of nature, which doesn't really reflect much in COP negotiations. I don't think we have a lot of time, but in case some I know Nemomo has been involved with the Rights of Nature Tribunal, and if there are other reflections that any of the panelists would like to share, please feel free. And then we will move towards the closing of the session. Yeah, I think Nemomo was gonna reflect on that question. Yeah.
Well, yeah, if very, very quickly, you know, a significant thing about the rights of nature for me is that the draft or the global declaration for the rights of nature and climate change was arrived at Cochabamba in 2011 at the meeting on climate change and the rights of nature. So the two are so interconnected, because with the runaway climate change, the rights of nature is being violated. And the rights of nature has obligations of humans, and what we as part of nature must do: stop undue militarization, stop extractivism, stop all the things, industrial agriculture, all the things that are harming the planet. So if it's actually elevated, rights of nature is elevated, respected, and of course, ecocide kicks in as a crime that is recognized at the International Criminal Court, then I think humans and corporations will have better incentive to take climate action. And that will be a great thing. But it's when we negate the right of nature, I see nature as just something to be appropriated, to be exploited, to be transformed. And when we think that we can make nature more efficient than she is, then that allows human beings to run roughshod over nature. And this has to be controlled and stopped. I think this is, climate action is very much connected to the rights of nature.
Yes, definitely. And thank you so much. So let's move on to closing of this session. I know some of you have had more interesting questions for our panelists and insights also yourself to share. And we encourage everyone to continue this dialogue by reaching out to us on social media page. Possibly the organizers could put in the link. But for now, we would like to conclude. And in the meantime, the event would like to call Anna of the Commission 19 of the International League of People's Struggle for closing remarks. Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Shristi. And once again, on behalf of the organizers of this forum, we would like to extend our warmest thank yous to all our guests for today, most especially our panelists, beginning with Ivan, Nemo, Bev, Harjeet, Leah, Vasna, and John. And of course, our favorite facilitator, Shrishti, for taking your precious time to share your insights and reflections with us on what has transpired and what did not materialize what we were able to achieve, and as well the monumental tasks that need to be done in light of the recently concluded COP26 negotiations. We also thank all our participants for sticking with us, sharing your time and thoughts as well with us. Allow me to close this session and inspect the whole of our COP26 engagement with this quote from Black feminist and anti-imperialist activist Angela Davis. She said, "It is in collectivities that we find reservoirs of hope and optimism." Our entire COP26 experience has shown us the power of the collective over the individual. As Harjit also has earlier said, it ranged from the many intersections of climate justice and social justice movements we have seen on ground and online, to the thrum of collective power we feel during climate marches that we had. We see it in the solidarity and even in the care. Let's use the term as Basna has mentioned, that each climate and social activist extend to each other, to humankind and the planet at large. The experience of COP26 and even decades of COP has shown us that decisive action comes not from the elected national officials and leaders who also come from and represent the interests of the elite. These are the same corporate, finance, and political elites who have for decades plundered and polluted the planet and kept most of the population, especially from the global south and frontline communities, poor and vulnerable. And now, they take advantage of the climate crisis to make even more money from carbon markets and offsets, as already mentioned by our panelists like Harjit, Basna, and Nemo. Decisive action, and as Greta Thunberg has said, true hope comes from the collective power of the people. This is a reservoir of hope and optimism. We should take this overall result of COP26 as a challenge to go back to the trenches, so to speak, to spread the word of accountability, justice, and radical change, forge even more unities and alliances, and hone our strategies in order to strengthen our collective power. The intersecting crisis of environmental degradation and climate catastrophe, extreme inequality, militarism, and the COVID pandemic demands that we need to wield this collective power even more efficiently to enact meaningful and drastically needed changes at every level of society. Gatherings like this give great joy and hope for better and more powerful actions ahead. As has been echoed over and over, this is not the end. We hope to see all of you again in future actions, future engagements and gatherings. And let me end with one of my favorite chants, El pueblo unido jamás será vencido, or the people united will never be defeated. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Anna. And thank you everybody for joining. It was really great conversation, learned so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
We are communities and peoples in the front lines of the climate and social crisis.
We suffer their enduring and irreversible environmental and social impact, rising seas, extreme flooding, water shortage, extinction of species, ecosystem collapse, food insecurity, displacement of tens of millions of people, and loss of lives.
Despite the gravity of the problem, climate ambitions of the world leaders remain woefully inadequate. Instead of reducing their emissions, historical polluters pump out even more carbon into the atmosphere. Governments and multilateral development banks continue financing coal and other fossil fuel plants in developing countries, locking out our economies and future into dirty and expensive energy sources.
Developed countries skirt culpability for their past, present, and future emissions by promising to achieve net zero or carbon neutrality by 2050. A deceptive language premised on cancelling out emissions in the atmosphere through techno fixes, accounting tricks, and carbon markets, rather than eliminating their costs. The capitalist drive for growth, expansion, and profit.
Indeed, some of the proposals on the table not only distract us from the real plans and action that equitable and justly address the crisis we face, they also seek to further colonize our territories and resources while profiting off our vulnerability.
Projects such as forest conservation, renewable energy farms, and biofuel plantations in developing countries, created to give rich countries and their corporations pollution permits, are driving massive land grabbing and subsequently the displacement of our indigenous peoples, local communities, and forest dwellers. This is climate imperialism.
Developed countries are not providing their fair share of finance to help us cope with climate change. In fact, they could not even deliver the bare minimum of the climate finance promise they made more than a decade ago. Instead of settling their climate debt, developed countries are burying us deep in loans for projects that do not address the real needs of the most climate vulnerable. Because developed countries are not fulfilling their responsibility, we now contend with the social, economic, environmental, and cultural impacts of climate change that are already beyond adaptation. For years, we have been calling for just compensation to deal with the damages to property and livelihood and loss of biodiversity, culture, community, and lives because of global warming. And yet, rich countries like the US and the UK that have built their wealth off fossil fuels are blocking efforts that would set in stone their liability and obligations.
Meanwhile, COVID-19 threatens to further deepen pre-existing problems of corporatized development, marginalization of people in the development process, and socio-economic inequalities. Economic recovery strategies, dubbed as the new normal, are increasingly unfolding to be the same policies that have led to the monopolization of natural resources, privatization of social wealth, and rising temperatures. In many instances, with the urging of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, important legislations and regulations to protect communities and the environment are reversed.
The crisis is only further aggravated with the erosion of people's democratic rights, such as our right to access to information, participation in the development process, and our right to organize and mobilize. We are enraged at how the UK government is using COP26 as a public relations stunt to greenwash its image and to posture as a global climate leader, despite failing to ensure the safe and democratic participation of parties, civil society, and the people's movements from the global south.
We face worsening repression, harassment, imprisonment, and killings at the hands of the state forces and big foreign corporations that want to capture our lands, rivers, mountains, forests, and other natural resources. We are communities and people in the front lines of the climate and social crisis, and we need nothing less than climate justice and system change.
We demand historic polluter implement immediate, rapid, and deep emissions cuts without the use of tax rates and false solutions that violate our human rights, rural and indigenous communities. We demand an equitable and just fossil fuels pass out at a pace consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
We demand developed countries deliver their promise of $100 billion a year in new and additional public climate finance, while also committing to a new finance goal based on the actual needs of frontline communities.
We demand advanced capitalist countries to provide additional public finance and compensation to the most affected peoples and areas bearing the brunt and losses and damages from climate breakdown to help them recover and rebuild their lives.
We reject carbon markets and all other false solutions to climate change that led to the plunder of our resources by the global north countries and corporations. We reject imperialist trade pacts that empower polluters and prevent people's access to climate-friendly technologies and low-carbon alternatives.
We support climate solutions, protecting biodiversity and preserving ecological balance, while safeguarding food sovereignty and people's rights. Securing land and tenure rights for indigenous peoples, farmers, and local communities are important in achieving such goals. We advocate for community-owned and controlled renewable energy systems.
We demand the recognition and protection of the rights of land and environmental defenders as essential frontliners to the climate crisis. In solidarity with the broader sectors and movements working for system change, we call for a new economics for the people and planet, not profits.
We are communities and peoples in the front lines of the climate and social crisis. We vow to fight for these demands inside and outside of the official climate negotiations with the broad masses in Glasgow and across the world.
Climate justice now.
Climate justice now.
Climate justice now. People and planet over profit.
People and planet over profit.
End climate imperialism now!
End climate imperialism. People and planet over profit.